Fallout Roleplaying Game is a tabletop RPG by Modifius, published in 2022 and officially licensed and based off of Bethesda's Fallout video game series, most prominently Fallout 4, but largely Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas as well. This tabletop RPG uses Modifius's favored 2D20 system, and the core rulebook, which runs 438 pages, covers everything you need to run multiple campaigns worth of sandbox-style Fallout adventures. In this video, I want to walk you through the highlights of the core rulebook, going over character creation, mechanics, and the setting, and then briefly go over some tips for players and GMs that might grease the wheels a bit with the game if they haven't played it before. And as usual, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you my pros and cons about this game overall. Just to kind of skip to the chase here a little bit, I think this game is really well executed in terms of its rules, its presentation, its thoroughness, and its emphasis on collecting items in the world and modding equipment. But if you're wanting to play it all rules as written with pencil and paper the old school way, it's kind of a huge amount of writing and bookkeeping when it comes to gear and equipment. Anyway, let's jump into the core rulebook and see specifically what this game is all about. The 2D20 system by Modifius, which they implement for just about every RPG that they publish, gets a lot of vitriolic hate online by a certain segment of the RPG playing world. But I have to be honest with you here, the system is fine, as long as you can pry your mind open a little bit and get with the flow of the meta currency. The basic skill check mechanic is core attribute rating plus applicable skills rating equals your target number. Then you roll 2 or more d20s with the hope of equaling or coming in under the target number on each die. Each die that does that is considered 1 success. A natural 1 is considered 2 successes. A natural 20 creates a narrative or semi-mechanical complication. Sometimes you need to roll more than 1 success in order to pass the overall test at hand. And when you roll extra successes, you can bank them as action points. Other 2D20 games call these points momentum, and for the GMs in those games, they're called threat. But in this game, the meta currency is always referred to as action points, and they are at the heart of the mechanics. You are constantly earning AP when rolling additional successes, and you share them in a pool with your party. But you can only have up to 6 action points in your pool. Thus, you are naturally encouraged to spend them with some frequency. AP can be spent to buy extra d20s on a roll, first and foremost, as well as get an extra action in combat or extra damage on a successful attack. I actually don't see anything wrong with this approach to gaming, and the only reason I'm having to say that is because there's a very loud but small group of people online who write off all of Modifius's games because they don't like meta currencies playing this heavy of a role in their game. It's really just a personal preference in the end, not any sort of objective qualitative issue with the 2D20 system. The heavy reliance on meta currency just means that players have more agency over the situation and can sometimes guide the fiction a little bit more towards their advantage. In combat, you get a major action and a minor action. A minor action, importantly, includes moving. Since the game by default uses zones instead of a grid or hex, your movement means moving one zone up to medium range. This is a little bit vague in actual practice, so having a GM with some experience with zones goes a long way. Major actions for your turn can include any of the following. In most cases, you'll be making an attack, which occurs in the following way. First, choose your weapon and target. If you want to hit a specific location on a target's body, you can do that in order to possibly disable that body part, but it means you'll have to roll 1 extra success on your roll. Then as far as what to roll, for melee, it's strength plus your melee weapon's skill as the target to beat. For ranged weapons, it depends on the weapon type. Although each weapon type has a different core attribute paired with it, those attributes are fortunately noted on the character sheet so that you can just look at the skill name and see what your target will be. You also just sort of memorize these attribute and skill combos after a few rounds. If you land a hit, you roll the weapon's combat dice, which are d6s, and add bonuses from perks, derived stats, extra spent ammo, and action points that you may have spent. One thing about those d6 combat dice, it's not super intuitive if you don't have the specialty dice. A 1 is 1 point worth of damage, 2 is 2 damage, but 3 and 4 are nothing, and then 5 and 6 are both 1 damage plus the weapon's special effect, if there is one. Okay, this is where I really started to realize how weirdly crunchy this game is, despite its lackadaisical approach to combat distances. You can do 4 types of damage, and every character in the game, both PCs and NPCs, have specific damage resistance ratings to these 4 types. Then there are actually 8 types of damage effects, which each come with their own quirky way of dealing damage on a target. This is not something that a starting GM is going to be able to keep in their head in their first session or two. It can be kind of overwhelming. Best practice here would be for players themselves to keep track of what kind of damage and damage effects their weapons do and remind the GM of those details anytime they land a hit. Body parts can be disabled and each come with temporary disabilities to your PC. When you are at 0 HP, they have to roll an endurance plus survival test each round until they are stabilized. A failure on this death check means they're dead. Healing comes in the form of injecting or inhaling some sort of chem, or succeeding an intelligence plus medicine check. Death in this game can feel like it's around the corner all the time due to the relatively low hit points that you start off with, but actually, recovering to full HP only takes 6 hours of sleep, and with 8 hours of safe rest, you actually pick up 2 bonus HP beyond your maximum. And you can actually recover from injuries during rest just by succeeding an endurance plus survival test, whose difficulty varies depending on how many injuries you have. This is all really pretty generous, but there are some optional rules about fatigue and disease that I'll show you in a minute, which swings back the other way and makes this game unusually harsh again. Actually, the game is not necessarily lackadaisical when it comes to zones. Despite zones having amorphous borders compared to grid or hex maps, they are full of characteristics and features that have a specific impact on the mechanics. Again, this zone stuff only really works if you have a GM who can effectively arrange each zone to be intuitively distanced from one another and make the map feel logical and fair. It's a bit more of an art than a science here, and unfortunately there are 0 examples in the core rulebook. Character creation is going to feel pretty familiar to you if you've ever played the video games. The core attributes spell the word special, and they are all pretty intuitive. I think the thing that challenges a lot of people trying a 2D20 game for the first time is how there are 7 attributes attached to about 17 skills, which make for 17 types of skill checks, but you can actually pair up any attribute with any skill, which results in roughly 120 possibilities. Some combinations are more common than others, but there are a lot of possibilities that require some abstract thinking. And there is a bit of a balance issue with the game as well when it comes to applying this list of skills to this particular setting. Survival, for example, comes up frequently in the game. It can be paired with perception to make a sort of nature check, or with charisma to charm an animal, or with endurance or strength for survival purposes, whereas the throwing skill, on the other hand, just isn't going to come up as frequently. One mildly interesting thing about the game is that there is no level cap. Every time you level up, you get +1 to your max HP, 1 skill rank to any of your 17 skills with a max of 6, and 1 perk, which we'll cover in a minute. But if you see here, once you have earned 21,000 XP and reached level 21, the fun's not over. Every level thereafter is calculated with this formula. As far as the character archetypes or origins that you can choose from, this was probably the biggest value proposition for me compared to playing the video games. Well, there are actually a lot of reasons why this game is more interesting and enjoyable than the video games, and I'm thinking of making a video about all of that. But these origin options are particularly fascinating. Whereas in the video games, you always play as a vault dweller or a wastelander, but here you can also play as a member of the Brotherhood of Steel, a ghoul, a super mutant, which is really out there, or my personal favorite, a Mr. Handy variant. And a lot of these choices come with some hard-coded pros and cons. For example, a ghoul, which is a necrotic post-human who is essentially immortal but can go feral, is completely immune to radiation, and is in fact healed by radiation. But you look gross. The super mutant has a max strength and endurance of 12, whereas the normal max for any attribute is 10, and you're immune to both radiation and poison damage, but your max intelligence and charisma are 6. Check out the glasses on this guy, at least he looks smart. Mr. Handys were all built before the nuclear apocalypse in 2077, but even 200 years later, they're still floating around because they run on nuclear power. They have 360-degree vision, but a bonus on sight and sound perception tests, and are immune to radiation and poison. But they cannot recover from injuries or even heal HP without actual repairs. Perks are a major part of the player experience, and it's kind of intimidating at first because there are so many to choose from. Out of these dozens and dozens of perks, some of them are really attractive from a player perspective, while some are really not going to come up that often in the course of play. One thing to really consider with these perks is their stat requirements. The best perks have some really steep requirements, like this concentrated fire perk, which allows you to re-roll up to 3 damage dice on ranged ammo spending attacks. That's actually pretty huge in this game, since it all but guarantees damage. But these stat requirements are high. And then there are those perks that you can't start out with at level 1, even if you have the stats for it, like Gun Nut or Gunslinger, which require level 2 or higher. Here's an extremely powerful perk, Meltdown, which requires max perception. When you kill an enemy with an energy weapon, they explode and cause energy damage to all nearby targets. Overall, these perks are mostly sort of campy and goofy, which is fine because that's the nature of Fallout. If you're looking for a tone of gritty realism, you can probably attain it to some degree with this game, but there's no explaining away some of these perks. Okay, so there's this major aspect of the game that I have really mixed feelings about, and that is the scavenging and crafting mechanics. First of all, the core rulebook is absolutely loaded with equipment, gear, weapons, armor, and consumables, which is fine, but there is a whole system in place for modifying and even crafting a lot of this stuff out of found junk. To do either, you need the right materials, a workbench of the right type, and proper training. I think one of the most unappealing aspects of all the gear minutia in this game is not necessarily the scavenging, crafting, and modding, but the attention to ammunition types. This is the sort of thing you see in a more serious post-apocalypse simulator like Twilight 2000. And of course, it's included in this game because ammo types are featured in the Fallout video games. But for a tabletop RPG, looking for and finding the right kind of ammo can be a huge buzzkill. There are actually descriptions for each of these ammo types, including 9 subtypes of syringer ammo. Actually, the various syringer ammo effects are pretty creative and interesting. I just find it tedious to have a gun that maybe shoots 38 caliber rounds and never finding the right sized ammo for it. There's no way I'm going to show you the 100+ tables of weapons and armor and gear in this book. It's frankly pretty staggering, but here's an example. This is a list of the small guns in the game, and you more or less get all the stats and information you need for each gun. But since modding is a thing, each gun actually has its own list of acceptable mods that you can slap onto it. And by extension, all weapons and armor in the game are described like this. On the plus side, once you have a gun you like in this game, it can become a little secondary character of yours, something you cherish and look after. On the other hand, losing a heavily modded weapon for any reason could be pretty devastating for a player. Here's the monster list of small gun mods, which each have stats and effects to replace or add to the base gun stats. Just like with most RPGs of this level of complexity, the default character sheet is simply not adequate to comfortably record gear details at later levels. This is one of those games that just needs a few extra blank sheets of paper if you're doing more than a one-shot. Check out this list of melee weapons. This table probably doesn't actually need to be this granular. Like, do we really need different damage ratings between a baseball bat and an aluminum baseball bat? But the fact is, this game is already super detailed with every other type of item, so why cut corners here? I don't recall being able to put armor on my dog in the video games, so this is a welcome little expansion to the player options. And they really didn't skimp on the power armor details, which almost seems like it needs a whole specialized character sheet to keep track of, because you've got helmet, torso, arms, and legs to keep track of, each of which can be modded. In a way, this is almost too much. How do you actually account for all these bits and pieces without an Excel spreadsheet or app or automated virtual tabletop character sheet? Oh, by the way, if you decide to play a Mr. Handy type character like I did, make sure you get to this section on page 146 that details plating upgrades. And if you want the good stuff, you'll need to invest in the Armorer perk. Magazines are a whole thing where you get a temporary perk or bonus that applies to one distinct situation. There are 20 potential magazines to find, but astoundingly, each magazine has multiple sections in it which grant all kinds of different temporary buffs. I have to mention the Pip-Boy, which of course not all characters have the fortune of having. Usually worn by vault dwellers, these wrist-bound computers will give you a variety of readouts that you will incidentally already have access to by virtue of operating your character through a character sheet. But importantly, a Pip-Boy will give you VATS, or Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, which ignores the difficulty increase that is normally incurred when targeting a specific body part in an attack. I really appreciated this list of robot modules. Again, you really want to keep an eye on the required perks before building a character or leveling up, because otherwise you'll probably never have the perk you need when you come across something you really, really want. Also, something you have far less control over as a player is this rarity level. A good GM who knows how to run this game is going to pay close attention to rarity and restrict the level you have access to, and for good reason. Check out this level 5 rarity Tesla coil that you can pop onto your robot PC. It deals 4 damage dice worth of damage to all nearby characters at the end of every turn in battle. It only costs 100 caps, but the 5 rarity should make this hard to come by. I mentioned earlier that you can really make this game pretty gritty and simulationist in terms of surviving a nuclear wasteland, and this is one of the optional rules that can make it so. Fatigue is this ridiculously punishing mechanic where lack of food, water, or sleep, or the effects of disease or exposure to the elements drains away your action points and your HP. I'm not really a simulationist type of gamer myself, partly because of the amount of clerical upkeep required on the character. Check out the different stages of hunger and thirst one might have to keep up with if playing with the fatigue rules. And the vectors for disease are virtually everywhere. It's hard to imagine playing the game with these particular rules and actually successfully avoiding diseases, which does feel realistic. I just don't know if that would be fun. Scavenging is another more central optional mechanic to the game that I'm not sure is really optional, actually, if you're really going to go for that Fallout feel. Here's the deal with scavenging. Anytime you want to search for scraps, you roll a perception plus survival test. If you're successful, you find the bare minimum of stuff that the GM designated for that area. If you want more stuff, you spend action points to get more rolls. Naturally, when you're in the scavenging mode of this game, you can run into obstacles in the form of locks and structures, as well as hazards like sharp objects or toxic chemicals. In the end, scavenging rolls come down to a bunch of tables like these, and I mean a bunch. Naturally, this can be a problem in a pencil and paper RPG where you have to write all this stuff down whenever your PC finds it. So really, you kind of have to use a spreadsheet or a VTT to quickly track all these items. You really don't want to have to be writing and erasing all this stuff constantly. Also, check out this random ammo table. You can imagine how frustrating it might be to constantly be finding the wrong types of ammo for your guns. The other major mechanic that goes hand in hand with scavenging is salvaging, which is the act of turning your junk into something better. This is essentially done with an intelligence plus repair test. One of the big potential barriers to salvaging is the fact that you can't do it just anywhere. You have to have the raw materials, of course, but also the right kind of workbench. It's entirely up to the GM if your PC ever comes across the exact right bench, but note the fact that there are 6 different kinds of required benches for different stuff that you might want to salvage. On top of that, you actually need the right so-called recipe or plans for any given item that you want to salvage. If it's a common item, then you just naturally know the recipe, but uncommon and rare items have recipes that are relatively difficult to get. As for the actual stuff you can create, it's dozens of pages of tables like this. Basically, you can craft just about any consumable item in the setting if you have the right workbench, materials, and the recipe, as well as all the mods. Power armor mods, robot mods, and weapon mods for every weapon type. A lot of the book is dedicated to describing the setting itself, and it's fairly fun to read through the lore. I, like a lot of people, really enjoy the lore of Fallout, from the alternate Cold War history leading up to 2077, to the nuclear war or Great War, to the 2 centuries of craziness that happened after that. But that being said, I feel like the chapters in this book on lore and locations in the Commonwealth, formerly known as Massachusetts, as featured in Fallout 4, could have used more emphasis on plot seeds and easy to reference little bits and pieces for a GM. For example, Robco is this huge presence in the setting because they manufactured all these killer robots and Mr. Handys and automatons that you're always running into. But this section on Robco is about 1 page, and they give you 2 seed quests. These seed quests are anemic. As a GM, this is less than 1% of the work required to flesh out a game session. And yet, the idea and the potentiality of Robco could fill 30 pages worth of history, encounter maps in the form of abandoned factories and office buildings, NPCs, and robot enemies. The chapter on Vault-Tec is a bit better. It spends a few pages explaining exactly what the company did and tried to do, and it describes a handful of the vaults, although I think some actual maps of these vaults would have been amazing. By the way, Modiphius did just put out a vault map pack, sold separately from the core rulebook. Maybe a cool concept for the core rulebook would have been just one big generic map of a vault with way more tables than just this to generate different zones. On the plus side, I appreciated that the authors discuss what makes a good vault delve at its core, and that's discovery, betrayal, and consequences. The GM and NPCs section deliver the goods in terms of guidance on how to structure a quest and what to throw at players. Most of the enemies statted at the end of the book have manageable entries, but honestly, there are a good number of them that have these absurdly long ability description blocks. I've actually run into this problem again and again with Modiphius games, where it really leaves me wondering how a GM is supposed to remember all this stuff during combat. Chaosium has the same issue, by the way. I think the solution for an end user here is to rewrite these longer descriptions into shorter, easier to reference notes, but that's very time consuming. What would be a lot cooler is if these publishers took a more aggressive stance on editing. By the way, on an unrelated note, this core rulebook features a lot of the concept art from Bethesda's development of Fallout 4, so it doubles as a really beautiful art book if you're into the Fallout series. I think there's actually an artwork of Fallout book, but if you get this book instead, you get a whole functional tabletop game along with the art. Also, spoiler alert, there are aliens in the Fallout setting. Look at that artwork, it's great. So here are a few tips that I was able to derive from my experience with the game. Player advice: know how luck points and action points work. Also, know your character's weapons and abilities. It should go without saying, but a TTRPG is different from a video game where you can just kind of smash buttons to quickly figure out the rules. It's not just common courtesy to know the basic rules and your PC's abilities. It makes you look cool and smart. Browse all the perks before settling on attributes and an origin for your starting character, since the best perks have all kinds of high attribute requirements. Don't be afraid to use your action points. You can use them outside of combat to buy extra d20s on a test before the dice are rolled, and during combat you can spend one for an extra minor action, 2 for a major action, or 1 to 3 for more damage dice. The extra damage dice spend is a gamble, since you could come up blank on those d6s, but the last thing you want to be is dead with a bunch of unspent action points. GM advice: control the speed of combat by the quality of the equipment. This game is particularly sensitive to equipment and weapon performance. If you hand your players rare weapons that deliver high damage or really good armor that drives up their damage resistances, then combat will go lightning quick. But if you want them to struggle for their lives, or at least earn the XP coming their way, then make sure to restrict the amount of high quality equipment they might come across. On that same token, if survivability in combat is becoming an issue for your players, consider throwing them a few pieces of quality armor. It would go a long way. So there's this whole separate Fallout tabletop game by Modiphius called Wasteland Warfare, and it launched around the same time as the RPG. I have to admit, when they released Wasteland Warfare, I had a hard time distinguishing the two products at a glance. Wasteland Warfare is, in fact, a war game that involves miniatures that you buy from Modiphius. Clearly, they're trying to capture some of that sweet war game market, and I don't fault them for it. But if you're thinking that maybe you can buy these minis to use in your RPG session, you'll find that the prices are pretty prohibitive. As an alternative, if you have a resin printer or know someone who does, you can check out Vermillion Miniatures, who has a Patreon and a store on MyMiniFactory. I'm not sponsored by Vermillion Miniatures. They don't know I'm mentioning them. They just happen to be a really good sculptor making Fallout related miniatures. As you might have noticed, the prices for these models that you can print at home are not really any cheaper than a set of official Wasteland Warfare minis, except for two major differences. One, if you have these models and a printer, you can print as many of the models as you want at any scale. And I'll let you in on a dirty little secret that you probably already know. Resin printed models at 28mm scale each cost about 5 to 10 cents in resin. The second big point about Vermillion Miniatures is that you can get new release packs for as low as $8 a month through their Patreon. It's a bit random on what you'll get each month, but it's all basically Fallout. Or to be more precise, generic nuclear wasteland survivor themed miniatures not officially associated with Fallout or licensed by Bethesda, but can and should totally be used in a physical game of Fallout the RPG. I'll leave links below. All right, here are my thoughts overall about the Fallout tabletop role-playing game by Modiphius. More GM-focused resources. Sections on the setting history and on the Commonwealth could have used more GM ideas and maps. The section on the Commonwealth is particularly wordy without really considering what the GM needs at the core to prep a session or a quest. And as far as maps in this book, even a single map that illustrated the zone concept would have been welcome. Item management is unwieldy on paper. I don't think it was a mistake to include a comprehensive scavenging and crafting system in this game. It's kind of unavoidable if you want to make a Fallout RPG feel like Fallout after all. But honestly, you need a spreadsheet or a VTT with some automation if you want to execute these rules painlessly. Transcribing the names of dozens and hundreds of items by hand and managing them all kind of sucks. Robot building pages are scattered. I only learned this by actually trying to build a Mr. Robot handy PC, but unfortunately, all the resources for what you can do for your robot character, which has its own specially formatted character sheet, is scattered throughout the book. I'll give you the answers here if you want to write them down. Page 54 is where you'll find the first options where you pick the Mr. Handy origin. There are some highly important options and features here. Then page 77 contains your initial equipment loadout depending on which type of Mr. Handy model you want to be generally. Then you'd hit pages 146 to 148 for the different kinds of armor your robot can have. And finally, on page 185 for robot modules, which you can have a maximum of 3 installed. This game feels like Fallout. I think this is the most important objective of this product. If they wanted to make a generic post-nuclear apocalypse RPG, then they could have done so without all the licensing. But Fallout is what the creators chose, and they nailed it. The stats and skills are right out of the video game. The perks, the body parts damage, the scavenging, the artwork, just tons of different elements that converge into a really authentic feeling experience. I understand that the relatively slow pace of tabletop RPGs is not for everyone when compared to the run and gun pace of video games, but this product delivers on the premise of its genre. Robust community on Discord. This game has a couple of things going for it at this point. One, it's from a well-established publisher and creator of games, Modiphius, which hosts a well-managed and well-populated Discord server. And two, the game has been out for almost 3 years at the time of recording, so it's just got a huge knowledge base in the form of experienced GMs and players, all of which who are willing to share their insights about the game with you in the online community. Very attractive core rulebook. As I mentioned a minute ago, the publishers used concept art from Bethesda to stock the rulebook, so it's absolutely loaded with really beautiful art. And since this is Modiphius, the layout and design is top notch. I can't say that Modiphius always knocks it out of the park with layout and organization, but they haven't really had any disasters in years by my reckoning. Supplements for settlements, more PC options, and a campaign. Since this game has been out for a little while now and it has picked up enough of a user base, Modiphius has developed several expansion books that have greatly bolstered the game overall. The settlement book gives you all kinds of options for starting and running a settlement in the wastelands, which was something conspicuously missing from the core rulebook that was ostensibly based on Fallout 4. The Wanderer's Guidebook gives you 230 pages of PC options, NPC ideas, vehicles, enemies, and equipment. And Winter of Adam is a 250-page campaign book with all kinds of locations and new NPCs and enemies that you can poach for your own game. Just overall, the Fallout 2D20 ecosystem is mature enough that you could really dive in as a gaming group and not really reach the bottom for some time. This game would perhaps coincidentally be perfect if you were stuck in a nuclear Fallout vault. It has all kinds of swingy and interesting mechanics to tell a fun story, but all mixed in with granular bookkeeping and item minutia that can keep you busy for years. If you have the luxury of time, concentration, and either lots of paper or skill with an Excel spreadsheet or VTT, then you're going to thrive with a game like this. Just remember, don't open that vault door for anyone. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this game down in the comments. I've left links for everything down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.